It's a great pleasure to welcome David Browne, President of the Royal Institute of Architects of Ireland, and John McCartney. And the front line, he's a chief economist with Savills, who are, of course, one of the country's leading auctioneers dealing with the residential sector as well. You're both most welcome. Can I ask you, lads, if this problem could be solved with analysis, it would have been solved long and ever ago. We're knee-deep in analysis. Could I have your reaction to the recommendations and whether you have a sense of Groundhog Day or were any nearer to getting actual increase in supply? David Browne, perhaps you could tell us your view.
Well, an interesting thing is that at present there are over 60,000 units underway across 4 of the country's top housing architecture practices. And they were commissioned from 2013 onwards, and that underlines the fact that it takes quite a time to get from inception through to being, as they say, shovel ready. There's another big issue, which is the cyclical nature of the sector. In 1998, we had 110,000 people employed in construction. It rose to 270,000 in 2007 and dropped to 85,000 in 2012. Between 1973 and 1993, around 25,000 houses were delivered each year on average, which was probably appropriate for the time. In 1997, 35,000 homes were built.
We know the history lesson there, but the point I'm trying to get is, we know the ESRI has said to catch up from the crash, we need about 45,000 new units a year. We're looking like we're going to get less than half that this year, and we've been getting even less over the last 2 or 3 years. What's happening right now?
Well, agreed that I believe it's going to rise to about 20,000 this year. However, it's really heartening to see that there is such a huge amount of houses on the boards or in the system, and it's also heartening to see that the new system where you could apply directly to onboard Planola is now beginning to achieve results. It had some teething.
The fast track,
and it's now beginning to deliver permissions. And developers, for instance, Cairn and Flynn in Cork, have said that they're ready to start building in the order of, I believe, 1,200 houses between them there. So I think we're at the beginning of hopefully.
Okay, well, that may be, but what about the question of affordability, and what about the specifics? Because you contributed to this report. The cost of land has rocketed up. Yeah. People accused of hoarding land. We were told that there would be vacant taxes and penalties on this. Has it happened? It hasn't.
It hasn't, but there is need for creativity around this issue. And a really good example to me is in Ballymun, where an affordable housing scheme has recently been completed. And under that, the local authority supplied the land and waived the development levies, which has a big impact in terms of the financing. And the Housing Association then managed the financing and building of the units and delivered 3-bed houses in a first phase at 175,000 per unit sale price, and later in the second phase at 190,000. So this is the kind of creative approach we need to.
So waiving the levies is a key point.
And there is a great amount of local authority and government land in Dublin and in other parts of the country that can be used to leverage. Does
it need to be brought to market? Simple as?
No, I think it's a bit more complex than that. I think there are ways around. There are things that need to be done whereby
maybe license builders to build on it.
Precisely, and that has been done before in a way. They come up with approaches whereby you perhaps get the builder, instead of building the normal 10% of social housing, you get them to build 60%, and then they get 40% for the
as a quid pro quo for getting the cheap land in the first place. Okay, John McCartney of Savills. Anything new in this report that catches your eye?
Well, I don't think so, really, Ivan. There's no surprises in it. I mean, just, I suppose, to pick up on the preamble that introduced the conversation we're having. I mean, I would say that whatever actions that we take today we cannot expect to see results overnight because
it's not like a tap. You can't turn it on. Okay.
It's like a juggernaut.
But we have been on about this since 2013.
We have, and if there is any criticism, I think, to be levelled at the political classes, it's not necessarily in the lack of action over the last couple of years. I think what actually happened is that during the tail end of the recession, our politicians were so preoccupied with dealing with the troika and the economic crisis that they neglected this problem that was developing all around them.
Well, do you think the supply issue is in train?
Yeah, I do, and you only have to look at the statistics here. So in terms of housing completions, in the rolling 12 months up to the end of February, we had just under 20,000 housing completions. Now, we know that the ESB connections is a somewhat upwardly biased measure of true housing completions, but still in all, that figure is up 30% year on year, so at least it shows a positive direction of travel. And furthermore, if we try and look ahead by looking at the leading indicators of housing commencement notices, again, it's good news, up 41% year on year in February, and if we concentrate on Dublin, up 50%. And in fact, if you look even further ahead at planning permissions, up 83% in Dublin in Q4 2017, and that is before the effect of the revised design standards for apartments, which will no doubt make it easier for developers to develop apartment schemes. And I believe, I don't know, David, if you would agree with me, but I believe that will encourage a raft of planning applications for apartment schemes in Dublin.
Okay, but people listening to this will be sick, sore and weary that the house they want, whether it's a 3-bed semi or a 2-bedroom apartment, is getting further away from their affordability reach. And now we hear, for example, big announcement budget day, 750 million for small builders to get money. Not one's red cent is next or near available, and now there's going to be a shortage of construction workers. David?
You're quite right. The sector is actually now pretty much at capacity. And from that point of view, I think it's important that we under the whole Rebuilding Ireland 2040, that we come up with a proper capital expenditure plan so that construction firms and people in the construction sector can plan for the
Do we need to get workers in from Romania?
Well, I think the number, the working population of construction people here is now pretty much at capacity. There are two real ways, I suppose. One is increasing the rate of training people, which is quite difficult, and the second is, yes, we will, I expect, have to start attracting people from abroad, and that again has become more difficult because their economic situation has considerably improved since 2002 when they initially started coming in.
What about land hoarding?
Well, I mean, this is a sort of an old chestnut, and we know that the vacant site levy is coming, and that it potentially is quite punitive. But in general, the builders and developers that I'm dealing with in our day-to-day business at Savills, generally they're mad keen to get going and they want to develop.
And so, what are you forecasting? Because we heard Jim Power saying for 2019. The rest of this year, we're gone past the Celtic peak now, a further 10% increase in Dublin. What do you think of that?
Yeah, well, I would take the view that house price inflation is going to soften from where it is now. Today, the CSO produced figures which showed that HPI house price inflation in Dublin's running at about 12.7% year on year.
Crazy stuff.
Yeah, it really is. But I think from about July of this year, we're likely to see a very sharp drop in the rate of house price inflation now.
Plateau?
Well, I'm not saying that house prices are going to stop rising, but the rate of inflation, I think, is going to sharply reduce. And the reason for that is that we had virtually no house price inflation in the first 4 months of 2017. So any monthly uptick that we have in the early months of 2018 shows up as a big year-on-year increase. However, from May of last year, there was a sharp lift in house price inflation, and when we get to the first anniversary of that, the base effect is going to lead to a sort of a fairly sharp reduction in the rate of annual house price inflation.
David, from a planning and an architect's point of view, if you go to New York, if you go to London, 12 million people, what they did was, I'm talking about Dublin now, they went up into the sky. We have about a 6-floor limit in a lot of parts of Ireland and Dublin. Do we need to just bite the bullet? Because Johnny Ronan was turned down for planning permission right beside the Tara station there to have a skyscraper. What about that?
Well, throughout Europe, the average height of buildings is 6 to 8 floors, and that produces
whereas in Ireland
considerable density. Well, in Dublin, I'd say we're at 2 to 3 floors. I did an interesting exercise the other day where I took the footprint of Amsterdam and overlaid it on the footprint of Dublin. Both are cities of the same size, in the order of maybe 1.2 million. And interestingly, Amsterdam more or less fits into Dublin south of the Liffey. And that's telling me that we are very
low density.
But I think the answer is in the region of 6 to 8 to perhaps 10 stories. I don't think the answer is necessarily for densification in the order of 20 and 30 stories. Now, there is another argument for buildings of 20 and 30 stories, which is perhaps to do with densification of the very centre, or perhaps new
in the
areas
hotspots, in the
exactly.
peak transport routes and so on.
But
because apartment living does seem to be the way to go.
Oh, for sure, yeah. The answer is going to be a huge... I think we definitely need a lot more apartments. The demographics are that most families now are in the order of 1 to 2 people rather than the old 3 to 5, and that, again, suits apartment living, so I can see that.
So, final word, you're selling these houses. Do you agree with the point about apartments?
Well, I do in principle. I mean, if I was to nitpick, I would say that my personal view is that the emphasis is too much on small apartments. I agree that we need to live in apartment type developments, but look, the reality is, and it's a fact and it's absolutely indisputable, we have had the biggest baby boom in 100 years between 2008 and 2012. We had over 460,000 people born during that period. So we've had a massive baby boom, bigger than we had in the late 70s, early 80s. And all of those little children are going to be dependents for at least the next 10 years. So that is actually preventing average household sizes from falling. And so I think we actually need to plan for family type homes and to try and shake off this fixation that we seem to have about small dwelling units for footloose professionals,
All right, my thanks to John McCartney, who you just heard there, the Chief Economist and Director of Savills Ireland Research, and David Browne, the President of the Royal Institute of Architects of Ireland, who contributed to today's government reports. I'll be taking your texts on this topic at 53106.